Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is the third class in this series on navigating the employer-employee relationship with Rabbi Jonathan Ziring. In this series, we explore a number of topics that address the nature of the employer-employee relationship, highlighting the rights and responsibilities of both sides. As always here at Drisha, we encourage everyone to turn on their video if they're able to, so we can kind of feel like we're together in a class. Also, you can feel free to ask questions by either writing them as a comment here on Zoom, or you can unmute yourself if you're with us. If you're watching us live on Facebook, you can write it as a comment there and present the questions to Rabbi Ziring. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Ziring.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Evie. So thank you everyone for coming. Good afternoon or good evening or wherever you are. So the first 2 weeks of the course, so we spend 1 week focusing primarily on the relationships of the responsibilities rather of the employee. And that was week 1, where we dealt with time management and taking on multiple employment. And last week we took a topic which focused on the responsibilities of the employer, focusing on the question of paying on time. And this week, we are going to turn to a topic that deals with the negotiation between these two parties, the issue of unionization and striking, which was a very heated topic in the last, let's say, 100 years and a little bit of Psak, as some of these issues were being worked out in the general world as well. And just for people who are with us, so again, as Evie mentioned, next week we won't have because of Purim, but in the next 3 classes, so the 4th week we'll be dealing with the parameters of when one can quit, how one can quit, and the like. And then in the last 2 weeks, we're going to deal with slightly different topics with the responsibilities of employers and employees when people working with them are violating various halakhic or ethical issues, dealing with how you deal with unethical bosses, unethical employees, whistleblowing, and those are the last 2 weeks of the course. So that's just to see where we're going. But as I said, today what we're dealing with after a week of focusing on the employer and a week focusing on the employee, now we're going to talk a little bit of how you negotiate it. As I put here in the introduction, there's a nice summary of some of these issues in Dr. David Schnall's book, By the Sweat of Your Brow, in chapter 7, Look for the Union Label, which is a nice overview, and some of the more complicated treatments we'll see, specifically an excellent treatment from Benny Brown that I include in the body of the share. Okay, so before we get to unions itself, and strikes itself, as Dr. Schnall points out in his chapter on the topic, unionization, striking, and the like, these aren't usually introduced into a employer-employee relationship for no reason. The reason it's there is because usually employees want to protect themselves. Usually the employer has more power, at least than the individual employee. But the employees en masse, if they join together and they make demands, so often that gives them power that any individual employee would not have. Now, Dr. Schnall points out that even before we get to this negotiation, it's clear that some of the mitzvot that we've talked about in the last few weeks, and some that we'll talk about in the coming weeks, highlight the rights of the employees to have their employers treat them well and respect them. So even before we get to the specific question of unionization, the idea that employees have rights from their employers, and that the Torah allows them to demand those rights, that's clear. So the question of what tool they use, which is the question of unionization, is fascinating. But in the background, you have to remember that the idea that employees have rights is really implicit in many different psukim and very different commandments and halakhic issues. So for example, he just throws out a few. One, and this is going to be the focus of next week, is Kili v'nei Yisrael avadim avadai heim asher hotzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim ani Adonai Elechem. The Torah tells us that you have to treat Jews who are properly, even when they're in your employ, even if they're slaves, because really they're the slaves or the servants of God before they are the servants of man. And as we'll see next week, that principle drives the Gemara to argue that a employee always has the right to quit in the middle of the day, to back out of a job, because to not give an employee the right to back out of a job would be to make him a slave or make her a slave. And the Torah doesn't want people, especially people who are not slaves, and slavery itself is problematic, but definitely people who are simply employees to be treated as slaves is problematic, and therefore the Torah goes out of its way to prevent that. Another law that he puts in as an example of employees' rights and the sensitivities that an employer has to have to his workers is in number 2. Ki tavo b'kerem re'echa v'achalta anavim kenafshecha savecha ve'el yecha lo titein. That when an agricultural worker is working in the field, so the Torah grants him the right to eat while he's working. He can't save it. He can't take the grapes. He can't take the oranges and apples and put them in a basket and take them home with him. But on the job, he's allowed to eat as much as he wants, which is again a recognition of the fact that the employee here is working out in the field. It's hot. It's hard work. It's cruel to sort of dangle fresh fruit right off the tree in front of this employee and not let them partake of it. And the Torah says you have to let them eat, whatever exactly is behind it. This idea of this sensitivity, and of course in number 3, the prohibitions, 3 and 4, the prohibitions of delaying payment, as we talked about in the first week, again highlight the rights of the employee. Okay, so that's sort of in the background. But let's turn to the specific issue of unions. So, while, as we'll see soon, the principles upon which unionization halacha are based go all the way back to the Gemara, really past that to the Tosefta. The discussion of unions in halacha as such is a pretty modern discussion. And this excellent article by Benny Brown called, here you have it in 5, Trade Union Strikes and the Renewal of Halakhic Labor Law, Ideologies and the Rulings of Rabbis Cook, Uziel, and Feinstein. He gives the background to why it is that in the 20th century, halakhic authorities started discussing the questions of unions as such. So he writes, the intellectual historical background, the models of regulation of labor relations in modern ideologies. In the traditional legal approach of pre-modern times, labor laws were a non-central part of the laws of contracts. More precisely, they were part of rental laws. In this framework, the concept strike was non-existent. The worker was hired, i.e. rented, for a job, and if he unilaterally stopped working, he was considered to be in breach of the contract. However, during the 19th century and early 20th century, in most Western countries, important changes occurred in this area of law, which anchored the rights of employees and employers in legislation. Labor law now became an independent branch of law. One of the most prominent changes was the creation of mechanisms for regulating labor relations through free associations representing employees and employers. Likewise, these laws recognize the right to strike as a legitimate means to deal with the workers' struggle for the rights and no longer construed strikes to be simply a breach of contract. These changes, okay, I think I just added an extra sentence there and cut it off. But Brown's fundamental point, and we mentioned this a little bit last week, is that what's new in the modern period is that general thinkers, legal thinkers, philosophers, and the like start to conceptualize labor relations between employers and employees as a unique area of law. And therefore, poskim who are writing, halakhic authorities who are writing in this period, start to struggle with the same questions. And two related questions that were raised in general society, and therefore halakha had to respond to, was again, the question of unionization, namely the idea that employees should negotiate collectively. And the second is specifically the tool that was often used by unions, which was striking, where collectively the employees would stop working in order to pressure their employer into whatever it might be, to give them higher salaries, or in the earlier strikes to provide safe working conditions, and the like. And therefore, halacha had to respond to these two new realities with the backdrop of labor relations constituting a standalone category of law. Okay, so that's sort of the background that we need to have in mind when we enter this topic, is that it's really coming on the backdrop of a universal conversation about labor relations as a unique category of halacha. Okay, so that's the background. Now, he notes that there were several overarching theories that emerged to explain the ideal way of dealing with labor relations. So he continues, communism was one. Communism would not settle for the enactment of labor laws to regulate relations between employers and employees, but demanded the total abolition of these classes and the creation of a classless society. This society was to be achieved through the nationalization of the means of production, entailing the transformation of all citizens, or as many of them as were able, to employees of the state. In such a state where all were workers and the workers were also the bosses, there could be no conflict with employers, and there would be no need and no room to secure the right to strike. Right. So one reality or one ideology that emerged to explain the proper relationship of employers and employees was basically to get rid of the notion. And communism basically said, look, everyone works for the state because the entire model of employers and employees is problematic. And in that idealized world, so then there would be no need for unionization. There would be no room for striking because right, there would be no employees and employers. However, two other ideologies that emerged did maintain the idea of employment. And as such, they had to respond to the reality of employer relationships. And those are the two ideologies he identifies are what he calls liberalism and fascism. He said, as he puts it here, the liberal position proclaimed that the solution to the plight of the worker lay in the free unionization of workers apart from employers, while anchoring the laws of the workers' right to strike and protest. Thus, it opened the arena to regulated power struggles between the two sides. In this model, the competing strengths of the parties enable the parties to engage in collective bargaining, at the end of which the respective sides will reach binding settlements, collective agreements. Fascism, however, saw the two previously mentioned models as representative of a position promoting discord in the fabric of societal relationships, and stated that such an approach is unacceptable. Its thinkers proposed an organic approach seeking harmony between the various forces in society. This harmony could only be achieved through the intervention of a third party in the relationship between the employee and the employer, i.e. the state. So what we have here in the background, again, is essentially four models of how to view the proper relationship between employers and employers. We have the communist model, which is get rid of the reality of employers and employees. You have what he calls the liberal model, which is that everyone has the right to stand on their rights, and therefore we should encourage employers to stand on their rights and employees to stand on their rights, and each side should have the power to strengthen their side as much as possible. So that means that it's the right of employers to collectively bargain and use whatever means is at their disposal, such as striking, to get their side, to get as much as they need, they want. You have fascism, which believed that there are employees, there are employers, but the state has to be sort of the third party arbiter. And then there was the fourth model, which, as he said, was rejected by this point in history, which was that employer-employee relationships are nothing more than contract law, and therefore it shouldn't be addressed distinctly. But as we said, in halacha, that fourth model falls by the wayside, as that isn't the reality people are facing. The communist model also doesn't really find favor in halacha, because halacha recognizes the reality of employers and employees. But the other two models, the quote unquote liberal model, the idea that everyone has the right to negotiate with as much power as they can muster for their side in this, in this relationship of various powers, and the quote unquote fascist model, right? The idea that there are employees and there are employers, but a third party has to come in and negotiate their rights. Both of those models, as we'll see, do have manifestations in halacha. Okay, so that's sort of the 15-minute background to why it is that in the 19th century and 20th century, people start asking these questions, and the ideological background for the models that are going to be suggested by the poskim. Okay, are there any questions before we see the sources? I know that's a bit of a longer introduction, but we sort of had to at least get the general ideologies, philosophies, changes in the world on the ground. So any questions, any thoughts before we get into the halakhic sources? Okay, so let's launch into it. So does halacha believe in collective negotiations, right? Which is really the background to unionization. So the short answer seems to be yes. If you look at number 6, the Gemara in Bava Batra, Daf Zayin and Bet, and 7b, in the context of communal responsibilities and neighborly responsibilities, we'll read this in English, but the Mishnah says, the residents of a courtyard can compel each inhabitant of that courtyard to financially participate in the building of a gatehouse and a door to the jointly owned courtyard. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel disagrees and says, not all courtyards require a gatehouse, and each courtyard must be considered on its own accords with its specific needs, right? So the background here is that we're talking about cases of, again, neighborly negotiations, people who live together. How do they relate to each other? How do they negotiate? What can they coerce each other to do? And that's the background of the topic. In number 7, the Gemara takes this farther and says, "V'rasha'in b'nei ha'ir lahatnot al hamidot v'al ha'sha'arim v'al schar po'alin u'la'asiya al kitzatan." Not only is it permitted for neighbors to, let's say, force each other to set up security for their, let's say, apartment building, it's permitted for residents of the city to set the measures used in that city, the prices and the wages paid to its workers, and to fine people for violating their specifications, right? So suddenly we see that not only is there this idea of negotiating rights as neighbors or as members of a city, but this spills over into employment as well. And the members of a city, and as the Gemara goes on to explain, specifically members of a particular guild, a particular craft, a particular type of worker, they can get together and they can set prices, they can set rules that everybody is bound to. And in number 8, the Gemara adds that not only do they have the right to set standardized prices within a certain profession, anyone who violates the standards set out can be held accountable. So the Gemara says that Hanu be trei tabache the avde inyane bahade hadade the cholman the avid biyoba de chavre nikrua limashche. So there were 2 butchers who made an agreement with each other that whichever one of them worked on the day assigned to the other, according to their mutually agreed upon schedule, would tear up the hide of the animal that he slaughtered that day, right? So they divided up the days. You work on Sunday, I work on Monday. And if anyone violated that agreement, so they would lose the hide of the animal that they slaughtered, right, as punishment. One of them went and worked on the other's day, and the other butcher tore up the hide of the animal that he slaughtered. They came before Rava for judgment, and Rava obligated him to pay the butcher who slaughtered that animal. Rav Yemar bar Shlamya raised an objection to Rava. Isn't it stated among actions that the residents of a city may take and to fine people for violating their specifications, i.e., those ordinances that the residents passed, right? So Rav Yemar said to Rava, you seem to deny the fact that there can be consequences to violating these agreed upon norms. But didn't we say you're allowed to do that? Rava didn't bother answering. But the Gemara then says, Rav Papa said he did well that he did not respond to him, as this matter applies only where there is no important person in the city, in which case it is permitted for the residents of the city to draw up ordinances on their own. But where there is an important person, it is not in the resident's power to make stipulations, i.e. regulations. Rather, they are required to obtain the approval of the city's leading authority to give force to their regulations. Okay? So here are the two key passages in the Gemara, right? The line on Daf Chet, which says that members of a particular guild, members of a city, are allowed to set rules for everyone in that profession, prices, what days you're allowed to work on, and they can even have consequences and punishments for those who violate the collective norms. And the second piece is that if there is a great person, an important person in the city, he needs to give his stamp of approval to these ordinances. Otherwise, the punishment, the consequences are not binding. Okay, those are the two key lines to understand our topic. So with just those two lines, what would you say? Does halacha recognize the ability to unionize? Are there limitations on it? Who has to weigh in on the proper parameters of the deals that they make? Right? What do you get just from these two key lines? Then I will continue. Okay. So what the post can really grapple with here is the following. Right? On the one hand, the Gemara clearly believes that employees, members of a particular profession, are allowed to make deals with each other, set certain standards for their employment, for the prices they charge, for the way they work, the hours they work, right? That's clear. And therefore, the Gemara clearly does set a model for unionization in the sense that unionization is a type of collective agreement where let's say all the, whatever it might be, all the people working in a particular factory, all the people working in a particular profession get together and they say, in the modern context, we aren't going to allow ourselves to be forced to work more than, 9-hour days, or we are not going to allow anyone to work in unsafe conditions, because if we do that, then employers will be able to force all of us to work in unsafe conditions, or we will not allow anyone to accept any salary less than a $15 an hour, whatever, minimum wage, living wage, whatever you want to call it, $20 an hour, whatever it might be. Because if any of us do that, so then we're weakening our collective power. And as you see in the Gemara, it's legitimate for people to say, listen, you work only on Mondays, I work on Tuesdays. And if you don't do that, you're weakening us collectively. You're allowed to say we're all going to charge the same price. So on the one hand, the idea that at some level, halacha recognizes the ability of people to get together, to collectively bargain, to make rules that everyone in their profession has to follow to the betterment of all of their place in society, that is clearly recognized. On the other hand, the limitation of Adam Chashuv, of the important person, whatever it means, clearly says that they don't have complete power, right? There's some limitation on how far mere negotiations and mere agreement can go. And therefore, there are times when, we can all agree that I work on Sunday, you work on Monday, he works on Tuesday. But if there is an important person and he says, you know what, I don't like that, I don't agree with those negotiations, there's something unfair about it, I don't like what you said. I don't like the consequences you put in place for violating the agreement. He's allowed to override it, or they're null and void to begin with. And therefore, there is some sort of limitation on the ability of workers to negotiate freely, right? So those are sort of the two pieces of information that everybody is dealing with. I'm going to run through some of the sources here to get to the modern. Now, where does this power even come from? Why is it that you're allowed to negotiate amongst yourself and even have consequences imposed on someone who violates the collective norm? So the Ritva clarifies that it comes from Hefker Beit in Hefker, from the general power of the courts to deal and control monetary issues. Now, the Meiri puts a significant limitation on this collective bargaining tool. And he notes that, let's say, the collective agreement of all the carpenters in society didn't affect everyone else in society, right? They all agree that, I don't know, they're all going to use mahogany for all furniture that they build because they've decided it's the only safe one. I don't know. And it doesn't really affect the price, and it doesn't come up with every case you want. So then they're allowed to do that. But let's say they all agree that we're not going to charge less than a certain premium for any table that we make or any chair that we make. And then one carpenter says, listen, I don't want to charge that much. I want to charge less because there are people who can't afford a premium table. And you're charging that much for a dining room table, but there are people who can't pay that. And I'm willing to work for less to help people. So the Meiri says in such a case, collective bargaining can't work because, collective agreement isn't enough because you may be helping the workers, but you're hurting the consumer. So the Meiri says, Mikol makom yirali she'ein b'nei umanut achat reshayin lachzok kitzat sha'ar b'nyanei umanutam. A guild, all the carpenters cannot make an agreement about price below reshut b'nei ayir, right? If you want to talk about collective agreements, so collective agreements have to take into account all relevant parties. And that's not just the craftsmen, it's not just the employers, it's not just the employees, it's the consumers. And therefore, the Meiri says, listen, we may recognize under certain circumstances the right to make agreements amongst yourselves, but you've got to figure out who is being affected. You can't make decisions that are going to affect other people in society without their input. So that's one limitation that we'll see will express itself in Psak. The Yad Ramah, building on the Talmud's limitation that if there is an important person in society, then people aren't allowed to just make agreements among themselves. The Yad Ramah notes that that person doesn't have to be a Talmud Chacham per se. He says, "V'hai adam chashuv dika'amrinan dafka." Well, sorry, I should rephrase that. It's not only a scholar, right? Dafka Talmid Chacham hamumune parnas al tzibor kirava bidoro. Aval parnas she'eno Talmid Chacham inami Talmid Chacham v'lav parnas. Af al gav da'atnu below da'atei tanai tana. The Yad Ramah says, what type of leader is allowed to weigh in and override the agreements made by all craftsmen in the city? So he says only someone who has two relevant qualities. He's a scholar and an actual leader. If someone's a leader, but they aren't informed by Torah, or they're a scholar, but they don't have a political role, they're not actually involved with people, so then they have no say. The only type of person who's relevant when we're trying to figure out whether a collective negotiation, a collective agreement is legitimate, is someone who's both a leader and a scholar, who's informed by practical, real world involvement in people's lives, and the Torah's perspective. Okay. Now, I gave you here in 14, 15, 16, 17, many, many examples of the how this expresses itself in psak, in later halakhic literature, and some more details. But I want to skip forward a little bit just to make sure we cover at least the basic ideas. One more Gemara before we move to the modern psak is one other potential source for the idea of unionization and collective negotiation, and that is this Gemara in Yoma. It's a very long Gemara, but we'll just run through the main point. The Talmud there is talking about a certain number of families who were experts in producing the showbread in the temple, in making the ktoret, right, the incense that was burnt in the temple. The Gemara records that the sages taught in a Braita, the craftsmen of the house of Garmu were expert in the preparation of the showbread. They did not want to teach others the secret of its production. The sages dismissed them and sent for and brought craftsmen from Alexandria in Egypt, a large city with many experts. And those craftsmen knew how to bake like the members of the house of Garmu did, but they did not know how to remove the bread from the oven like they did. The showbread was baked in a complex shape, and it was difficult to place it in the oven and remove it without baking it. The difference was that these Alexandrians light the fire outside the oven and bake it outside the oven, and these members of the house of Garmu light the fire inside the oven and bake it inside. In the case of these Alexandrians, their bread becomes moldy over the course of the week. In the case of these members of the house of Garmu, the bread does not become moldy. When the sages heard of the matter, the bread of the imported craftsmen was of lower quality than before. They said, whatever the Holy One, blessed be he created in his honor, as it is stated, everyone who is called by my name, I have created for my glory. In deference to God, the sages should diminish their honor for the greater glory of God and let the house of Garmu return to their original station. The sages sent for them to reassume their previous position, and they did not come. They doubled their wages, and they came. Right? So the Talmud tells the story that there was this family who knew how to make the bread for the Mishkan, for the Mikdash rather, for the temple in a unique way. They didn't want to give out the secrets. They didn't want to work for the salary they were working for. So the rabbis tried to find somebody else, to get a new, right, to fire all of them and hire somebody else. And it didn't work because they weren't as good. And their collective agreement to not work until they were paid double led to an increase of their salary. So here you have an example in the Beit HaMikdash of seemingly collective negotiation. Though, as we'll see, this is not so simple, because as the Talmud goes on to show, and I'll sort of summarize it outside, the Gemara notes that the reason they did it wasn't just for salaries. There were ritual reasons in terms of the honor of the Beit HaMikdash. So it's a little bit more complicated as to whether this is really a good model. David Schnall thinks that this is a somewhat good model for unionization, and even for striking, even though it's more of a lockout than a strike. But the Minchat Tzvi, I gave you in 19, thinks that this is not a good example for sort of classic unionization and striking, specifically because it seems like the only reason that they got their way was because there was no other choice. They didn't really listen to them, right? It wasn't like they negotiated with them as a union. It wasn't like the employers, in this case, the rabbis, tried to deal with them. The family just decided that they were going to not produce. And when the rabbis had no choice, they came back to them. It's sort of just a case of necessity. It's a case where, yes, they sort of unionized and had a strike, but it doesn't really show that the Talmud approves of it. It just sort of shows that sometimes it happens. Okay. So in what Brown notes in 20 is that in the secular Jewish world and in the halakhic Jewish world, you end up having what he calls the liberal model, right? Which again, fundamentally believes that employer-employee relationships should be determined by negotiation and therefore favor the idea of unionization, and basically allowing employees to gain whatever strength they can in numbers to strengthen their place at the negotiating table. And the other hand, the fascist model, which believes that there should always be a third party who's more expert weighing in on any negotiation between the employer and the employee. So in secular Jewish history, he notes that the liberal model was adapted by the Tzionim Klaliyim, the general Zionists, and the revisionist movement with Zev Jabotinsky adopted the quote unquote fascist model. And I gave you here if you want to read it. But moving to halacha, what he notes is that there were poskim who basically adopted the liberal model, and poskim who adopted again, I know it has bad overtones, but I'm using his terminology here, the fascist model. But to put it differently, there were poskim who looked at our Gemara and said, you see that the Torah believes that workers have the right to agree among themselves to set certain prices, and that affects the reality in the employment market. And therefore, unionization is something that halacha should respect and should allow employees to negotiate with their employers collectively without a third party being involved. And they basically emphasize the first part of the Gemara, which allows employees and members of a particular craft to set rules for everybody in that craft. On the other hand, there were poskim who really focused on the second half of the Gemara, the idea that such negotiations aren't legitimate without an outside party, which in the fascist model is the government, but in the halakhic model, the halakhic model is going to be the Beit Din. Right? He's going to be the court. And Rav Kook and Rav Uziel, Brown argues, take the quote-unquote fascist model, but again, it's not quite the same, and therefore the manifestation of a halacha he calls the corporative model. And as we'll see, Rav Moshe Feinstein takes the liberal model. So Rav Kook and Rav Uziel believe that unions can only exist with the involvement of the rabbinate, and the rabbinate has to weigh in on the agreements that are made by unions. And Rav Moshe Feinstein mostly believes that they do not. So I gave you a few quotes here from Rav Uziel, but I want to just sort of read some of the key lines. What you have here, I gave you the entire tshuva in Hebrew by Rav Uziel, so if you want to look at it inside, you can, but we'll read just the key paragraph from Brown in his translation of Rav Uziel. So Rav Uziel says, in my humble opinion, it appears, I'm going to skip the striking. I'm going to come back to the striking. Here. The rationale for this law is that no trade organization can be objective in its decisions, but only subjective. And their own self-interest blinds them from seeing the employer's point of view. Moreover, the existence of one organization leads to the establishment of another to counter it, and they both do not limit themselves to their direct interests. And so the constant clashing between the two sides, the workers and the employers, never stops and is followed by blind resistance and constant mutual hostility. So Rav Uziel says, listen, I recognize the ability of workers to negotiate and to collectively negotiate, but it can't be that halacha respects their right to negotiate and allow that to be the only standard by which they negotiate with their employer, for the very simple reason that he doesn't believe that the employer understands the employee or that the employee cares to understand the employer. And therefore, you need a third party. So following the quote unquote the fascist or corporative model, focusing on the second half of the Gemara, which finds an important rule for the Adam Chashuv, the important person in the negotiations. He, on the one hand, respects the ability to unionize, but only if decisions are made with a Beit Din. And therefore, he writes, you should establish a distinguished court, a Beit Din, assembled of members fluent in Torah law and academics proficient in the field of economics and societal market conditions. So they jointly enact a detailed labor legislation and afterwards appoint permanent judges to adjudicate on the basis of this legislation all the conflicts that occur between the workers concerning the proper division of fair labor amongst themselves and settle disputes between the workers and employees concerning their mutual relationships, right? So Rav Uziel and Rav Kook as well believe that, yes, workers are allowed to unionize. Yes, they can collectively negotiate, but there always needs to be an outsider, a Talmid Chacham, a Beit Din, experts that are involved as a mediator between the employer and the employee. And if we have to sort of reduce it to its most simplest form, they, so to speak, preference the second half of the Gemara, which gives a central role to the Adam Chashuv, to the important person in the negotiation. At the other extreme, you have Rav Moshe Feinstein, who, while he does somewhat involve the Beit Din, does seem to recognize not only the right of workers to unionize, but their right fundamentally to negotiate with the employer of their own accord. And therefore, in the key lines here on page 12, concerning the associations of workers called unions, which make regulations, determine set wages, prevent employees from firing them, and help each other through strikes and similar means for their benefit, I do not see any shade of prohibition. On the contrary, we see, moreover, that they are allowed even to make terms contrary to the set halakhic law, as in Bava Batra 8. According to this source, they are allowed to impose sanctions for enforcing their terms and even cause damage to a person who violates them, such as tear his animal skins. And if so, in the cities of this country, since no stage is appointed for such matters, it is tantamount to the situation of having no distinguished man available. In such a situation, the law posits the terms and regulations that the residents enacted remain in force, and all the more so in our country, where they have permission from the government to enact such regulations. So if we pause here and summarize, we see in the Gemara and Bava Batra, on the one hand, workers can clearly jointly negotiate. On the other hand, there seems to be some role for an outside party, an expert, a Talmid Chacham, a scholar, to weigh in on whether the negotiation is in the proper spirit of Torah law. Some poskim give emphasis to the first half and simply say, look, the Talmud recognizes the ability of workers to jointly make agreements that will affect other people. And from here, they derive that halacha recognizes the ability to unionize, and they downplay the importance of the Adam Chashuv, or they just say that you don't have to have it. In most places, you don't have it. And therefore, in most places, employees have the right to use unionization to strengthen their position and negotiate directly with the employer. And if that means setting certain rules in the workplace, certain salaries, hours of work, safety conditions, that is their right, and they can negotiate as they see fit. And that's really the model adopted by Rav Moshe. On the other hand, Rav Uziel, Rav Kook, focusing on the second half of the Gemara, the idea that yes, negotiation is legitimate, but there should be an outsider who weighs in and says, this is fair for the employer and the employee, that it's fair for society, it follows in the spirit of Torah law. They focus on the importance of Adam Chashuv and therefore set up a what he calls a corporative model or parallel to the fascist model, where you believe that an outside party has to enter into the negotiations with employers and employees to make sure that everyone is heard. And that, again, he ascribes to Rav Uziel and Rav Kook. Okay? So that is sort of the first half here of the issue. And those are the two main models where, again, both models recognize the ability of employees, if they see fit, to unionize. On the other hand, they limit it or don't limit it based on outside help, based on whether they emphasize the first half of the sugya or the second half of the sugya. And we saw certain positions in the Rishonim that already sort of point in these directions, with the Ad Ramah limiting what types of leaders can be involved, which of course goes more in the direction of Rav Moshe, where it's only very specific cases where an outside party should get involved. Or people like the Meiri who say, no. If anybody is affected in society besides for the employer and the employer, the employee and the employer, someone has to weigh in to make sure that everything is being done fairly. So Ilana asks in the chat here, are the positions of Rav Kook and Rav Uziel and Rav Moshe based on culture or location? So Brown argues that yes. Brown argues that Rav Moshe, and you can go to the article, it's available online, consistently throughout his psakim, believes that American democracy and its emphasis on the rights of the individuals and not imposing the position of the government and the government sort of giving space to people is a positive. And therefore, he argues that Reb Moshe's position is a function of his deep-seated belief, that the rights of individuals without government involvement, the rights of democracy of the individuals to decide is halachically valuable. And yes, right, this is part of his appreciation of the reality in America. And Rav Uziel, Rav Kook, he argues, yeah, it's right. They're living in Israel, which has a bit at that time of a more socialist feel, not fully communist, but definitely more socialist. And the idea that the government should be involved. And yes, he does argue that the reality that they're living in affects the models that they emphasize. Take it or leave it. I think there's something there. He really develops the idea quite strongly in all of their writings. There's another question. Are we doing class on the 13th because of Purim being on the 16th? Is there a change in schedule? Eva can answer that, I guess, at the end in terms of scheduling. I'm not sure, but let's save that.
Oh, okay.
There, in the chat, there's something about the scheduling of the class, but we'll do that.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
We'll do it at the end. Okay. Okay. So as to Ilana's question, yes, Brown really develops this, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. Okay. Any other questions so far? And what we've seen, comments, thoughts, or as one of my madrichim used to say, jokes. Anything you want to add that's relevant at this point? Or should we quickly sort of overview striking? Okay, so I'll move quickly to striking. So again, we've seen two different models for if and how unions can and should find their place in a halakhic society. That really just speaks to the general idea of joint negotiation. But the specific question of whether once you have employees unionized, should they try to get their way by striking? This was a much more complicated question in halakha, and that at two levels. One was the question of whether striking in general is a problem because it's a breach of contract. And the second is, is even if striking in theory is legitimate, is striking legitimate for professions where there is a cost to society if all the members of a particular profession stop working? And the classic examples that were discussed by modern poskim were doctors and educators. Because of obviously by doctors, the importance of human life, and educators because of the importance of Talmud Torah and the idea that at least kids should never be deprived of their right to learn Torah. Okay, so so here we will have to sort of summarize this, but the Gemara in Bava Batra brings a discussion specifically of competition, right? Of the legitimacy of competition. So I'm not going to get into the whole discussion there, but the Gemara there suggests that people have the right to close down competition, at least from outsiders. Now, how outsiders are defined is very complicated, but in the classic case, if two people live in the same alleyway, if someone lives in an alleyway, he is a fish merchant, and someone comes from a next door, a neighboring city, and wants to set up a fish store, you can stop him. You can stop him. Now, based on that, the Shnal and the Tzitz Eliezer before him point to this idea that you're allowed to stop people from working if that's going to harm your position in the market. And therefore, the Tzitz Eliezer suggests, based on this, and Shnal has developed this in his book, that since you see that you can close down competition if you can explain why you have a right to be here and the other person doesn't, that may be proof that striking is legitimate, and it's illegitimate to strike break, to stop people from striking by bringing in outsiders, because that might be a violation of competition laws. Because if you have a union and they are the workers in your factory, and the way that you are going to get around listening to them is by bringing in outside workers, so that might be an unfair competition, and that can be prohibited. So the Tzitz Eliezer, for one, seems to support the notion of striking, and actually take this as a proof that not only can workers use striking as a tool in their toolbox, the employer is not allowed to strike break by bringing in outside workers. However, most poskim really didn't love striking. And the reason really was because they saw this in many ways as a breach of contract on the one hand. And the second point was that they felt that it caused unfair loss to the employer. So Rav Uziel, for example, who, as we saw already, was in favor of the corporative model, right? The idea that employers and employees need an outsider to be involved. Also, not surprisingly, didn't like striking, right? He thought that striking was really problematic because striking for him was exactly why he didn't believe that you could have straight employer-employee negotiations without an educated outsider, because striking was basically a show of force, unmediated by an objective outsider, by the employees. And since he didn't think that was okay in the original negotiating, he also didn't think it was legitimate in terms of striking. Not surprisingly, Rav Moshe Feinstein, who thought that negotiations could be carried out directly by the employers and the employees, was also more open to the idea of striking as a legitimate tool. Because if you think that at the end of the day, halacha recognizes the rights of employers and employees to negotiate it unhindered by outside parties, so then striking should be a tool in their toolbox. Now, just to throw out in the next minute, and then I'll take questions. As I said, even poskim who, let's say, are okay in theory with striking, either like the Tzitz Eliezer because they think that striking is fair and strike breaking is a unfair violation of competition law, or because, like Reb Moshe, they believe that negotiations should happen between the employer and the employee, and whatever tools they can use, they have at their disposal, they're allowed to use. Even such poskim weren't thrilled or thought it was outright forbidden when it came to professions where a mitzvah was involved, because then there's a ritual side, right? You're not just hurting the employer, but in the case of doctors, you're hurting the patients, and in the case of of educators or rabbis, you're hurting the students. So here, just to, I'm just going to sort of describe what I have here. Rav Aaron Cutler in a tshuva in Mishnah Rabbi Aaron Binyan Shvita B'Yeshiva rules that educators are not allowed to strike because, as you see, sort of here in the middle, there are spiritual costs to it. Rav Moshe doesn't love it, especially in the context of educators, but as a last resort, even by educators, he does seem to think that it's a possibility, though he obviously goes out of his way to try to avoid it. And therefore, he says here all the way at the end again. And this follows Rav Moshe's model that fundamentally he thinks negotiating and any tools that the employees have, they're allowed to use. Again, when it comes to Torah, because you're denying students their right to learn, he doesn't love it. He doesn't rule it out entirely. He says at the very end of his tshuva here, he says, look, aval lefa'amim rechokim tuva. I don't love it, but in very rare circumstances, if the bosses, the heads of the yeshiva, don't care about their teachers at all, right? And right, it's clear that it's fair, whatever, and you know that it's going to help to strike. So if you push me against the wall, Rav Moshe says, if the only way for the rabbis, the teachers, to get proper salary in the yeshiva is to strike, he's even willing to tolerate it, again, because of the ritual pressure and the denial of education to the kids. He doesn't love it, but he does think that it is, if push comes to shove, plausible. And as you can see here, the Minchat Shlomo, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach weighed in on this. And I gave you here, I'm just sort of running through it. The Nishmat Avram here summarizes the question by doctors, where he notes that most poskim were really opposed to doctors striking, especially if it's going to hurt potential patients. And that's the position of Rav Yitzchak Weiss, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And Encyclopedia Talmudit here summarizes it as well, and notes that most poskim really don't like doctor strikes. Now, obviously, you've got to ask the question, but what if, the hospital takes advantage of that, takes advantage of the fact that the doctors aren't going to let the patients die and doesn't treat them fairly? What do you do? So that's really a complicated question. And as you can see, I gave you here about 10 pages worth of tshuvot. As you can see that some poskim really do try to negotiate it. But again, when it's going to hurt potential patients or it's going to hurt children who are not going to learn, poskim are really, really hesitant. Even those, Nishman Avram, is Rav Avram Sofer Avram. He's both a doctor and a rabbi, and he's written one of the authoritative works on halakhic medical ethics. And he really summarizes sort of the modern position. Okay, because we're at 9 o'clock in a minute, so just to summarize, the first half of this year, we dealt with unions. And we noted that in the sense that the Talmud recognizes the ability of members of a guild, of a craft, to collectively negotiate and make deals, everyone agrees that some level of unionization is clearly respected by halacha. The main argument is how much do you emphasize the first half of the sugya, the first half of the topic, where it seems to be that most decisions are made by the employees and the employers without outside help, which would open the door to basically straight employee-employer negotiations without outside participation, which is what Rav Moshe focuses on. And how much do you go to the second half and set up a corporative model like Rav Uziel and Rav Kook and believe that, yes, employees can negotiate, but there should be an outsider for them, a court, a rabbinical court that weighs in and says, this is fair from the perspective of the employee and the employer. So that was the first half of this year. And the second half, we quickly went through the question of whether when you have a union, if they can use the model of striking. On the one hand, you have the Tzitz Eliezer, who believes that they can strike, and maybe strike breaking is even forbidden because it's a type of forbidden competition. Reb Moshe, following in his belief in the liberal model, does believe that any tool that employees have that can help them in their negotiations is fundamentally legitimate. On the other hand, poskim like Rav Uziel, who believed that you always need an outside party to be involved to see whether things are fair, they really oppose strikes because they see it as a breach of contract and as a way of causing a loss unfairly to the employer. And then the last thing we noted is that when there are mitzvot involved, namely medicine, where you have an obligation to take care of the patients, and Torah education, where you have an obligation to the students, there, even poskim are more open to the possibility of striking, really don't love it. However, as Moshe notes in the context of education, even there, they might not rule out striking entirely. They might just say that when there is a mitzvah involved, whether it be refuah, whether it be medicine or education, striking really has to be a last resort. So again, you have the authorities who don't like striking at all, those who accept it as tolerable, and those who say that it's either forbidden or at least a really last resort when you work for a profession where failing to work isn't just a monetary question between the employer and the employer, but is also affecting in a spiritually and physically important way third parties like patients or the poor children who have no one to teach them Torah. Okay, we're 2 minutes over time, but any questions? Let's take them now. But I think before we take questions, Evie, do you want to just announce the schedule since there were a few questions on it, and then we'll and then we'll take questions on the class itself.
Yes, that sounds wonderful. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify. So we're ending today's class shortly. Next week, we are not going to see each other for this class. So in other words, there is no class on March 16th. I hope all of you get to celebrate Purim. And we don't have a makeup time that week. There's just no class next week. And then the following week, we will reconvene on March 23rd. So the next class after today's class is March 23rd. Just want to make sure.
3 more weeks, right? 23rd, 30th, 6th. That's right.
Let me double check that I said everything correctly. So two weeks from today is the next class.
Right, and then there'll be 3 more. There are 3
oh,
more
I
weeks.
see. Yeah, I apologize. Let me double check. So there is class on March 23rd. There is class on March 30th. And there's class on April 6th. So yeah, that's correct. And then April 6th will be the last one. So 3 more classes after today, but we're skipping next week. Does anyone have any questions about that? Just to make sure we're clarifying it. We really want everyone to be able to join us. So, okay, seems like we're good. So it looks like there's questions, more material questions in the chat. So would you like me to read them to you, Rabbi Ziring?
No, I see it. Okay, perfect. So Diane asks, is there a difference between secular teachers and religious teachers? So, so you might think that there is, if you think, right, as we've seen, that the reason that teachers have less rights to strike is because they're teaching Torah, and therefore you're harming these students. So you might have, in a sort of halachically recognized way, so you might have thought that halakhic Torah educators have less rights to strike, but secular educators have more rights. And that might be true according to some authorities, though I pulled up here that Rav Aaron Kotler actually raises this possibility and rejects it. And he writes here, right? You might have thought that there's a difference between Torah educators and secular educators. Right? Because all the Torah considerations don't apply to secular teachers. But then he says, no, and this is sort of surprising coming from the founder of the Lakewood Yeshiva, how much significance he gives to the secular education, but he does. And he says, Ach nir'eh, digam zehu inyan ruchani, even your secular education is spiritual. V'yesh v'zeh davar ha'avud mitzad chinuch hatalmidim u'shmiratam. And therefore, A, it's spiritual, and B, there is something lost. There's still victims here, right? The students are still unwitting victims. They're third parties, and therefore the same restrictions for that he puts on striking for Torah educators, he actually applies to secular educators as well. Though not all authority seems to share his conviction, because it could be something that's much more local to Torah. But for Rav Aaron Cutler, it seems to be a combination of the recognition that secular education also has spiritual value, and the recognition that the limitation on striking for teachers isn't just about Torah, but it's about the fact that students are the unwitting victims. Sort of they're the collateral damage in this, and that's not fair to them. We saw, this was a lot of what people were complaining about in Israel, where there was a lot of fighting between the teachers union and the Ministry of Education over Corona restrictions, and then how much of the summer, how much after we missed weeks of school 2 years ago, how much of that could be made up in the summer, and how much vacation you could take away from the teachers, right? There was a lot of discussion of how, not the students just didn't get a voice, right? The Department of Education had its voice, the teachers union had their voice, and the parents and students had no voice, and therefore students just lost weeks of school, months of school, and the only thing being discussed was, the contracts of teachers and the like, and obviously safety. But by the time we were making up with vacation, it was more about, can you force teachers to work on their vacation, or what should have been their vacation? And there wasn't enough discussion about the students. Whatever agreement you would have come to, that just sort of wasn't in the picture in the same way. So to Diane's question, Rav Aaron Cutler at least thinks, because of the spiritual value of secular education and the collateral damage on students, the same limitations in striking will apply to them, even though he recognizes that one could have gone in a different direction. I'm not sure I clarified this enough before, but Ilana had asked in the previous question, who is the Nishmat Avraham? So again, as I mentioned briefly, Nishmat Avraham, there are two basically go-to works on halakhic medical ethics. One is the Encyclopedia of Halakhic Medical Ethics by Rabbi Dr. Avram Steinberg, published both in English and in Hebrew. And the other is the Nishmat Avram, written by Avram Sofer Avram. Both Dr. Steinberg and both are rabbis, doctor, and both are writing both from the medical perspective and from the halakhic perspective. And in the sheets that I gave you the treatment from both of them, both from the Nishmat Avram and from the Encyclopedia of Halakhic Medical Ethics, the Hebrew version, and their approach to striking in the medical context, where they both summarize it from that sort of insider's perspective. Okay, those are the two questions I had here in the chat. Any other questions by chat? Deborah, I see you raising your hand. Okay.
Yeah, I also put my question in the chat, but I'm happy to say it out loud.
Did I miss it?
It was sent directly to me.
Okay,
oh, I'm so sorry. I clicked
no,
on
that's okay. I was just about to raise it. Would you like? Yeah, you can just go ahead.
I got it. So I was asking, what about other employers that could be said to be facilitating mitzvot, like people who provide food for Shabbat, clothing for Yom Tov, especially in a small town where there might only be one provider of whatever it is?
Right. So the major discussion is is by educators and by doctors, but there is some discussion of exactly that case in terms of forcing people to work. Now this is going to touch on what we see in 2 weeks, which is it's complicated a little bit also by the fact that people are allowed to quit, but as we'll see. In that context, there is a lot of discussion, but what if you are the only grocery in the in the town, and if you quit, no one's gonna have food, no one's gonna have clothes for Shabbat, for Yom Tov, or in general. So yeah, the primary discussion halacha is doctors and educators, but there are smaller discussions about other mitzvot or other essential workers. And yeah, in the COVID discussions, it became so clear that limiting our discussion of essential workers to doctors misses the point, right? Because the people who work in groceries, the people who work, right, who deliver food, the people who work in sort of the related fields to to medicine, and even whatever, sanitation workers and the like, there was a stronger recognition that other things are essential and as it were mitzvah professions. So yeah, I think there is less discussion in halacha about it. There's a little bit, especially in the quitting discussions, but I think that any responsible posek, and I haven't seen it, but probably some of the COVID shuvot out there, and as I get a chance to sort of read through everything that was there, probably some of the COVID shuvot dealt with that question, because you were seeing strikes or mass quitting of people who work in grocery stores, sanitation workers, and other essential workers. But I guess, conceptually, definitely there should be overlapping between them. If I find specific discussions, I'll take a look back at. I haven't read the whole book, but there was that book that came out at the beginning of last year, Haviani Chadarav, which is a collection of about 500 pages of response that came out about COVID. There's got to be something there on some related thing. If I see something, I'll send it. I'll send it directly to you when I find it. And it was great. It was great to see Rabbi Clapper yesterday. He came by for a few hours. It was very nice.
I heard you said your kids are adorable.
Thank you. I think so. But yeah, and again, maybe in quitting we'll see a little bit, but if I see explicit shuvot on it, I will send it along. But I don't think it's in the sources that I put here, which were, as it was, 23 pages long, and I had no hope of getting through everything. But I will try to find something explicit on it if I can. Okay. If that's it, then we still have a few minutes, but if anyone else has questions, now's the time. Otherwise, as usual, you can email me. And if not, before everyone runs away, Purim Sameach to everyone. Next week, enjoy Purim. I will. I hope I'll be enjoying Purim. And then we'll meet in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Evie. Purim Sameach.
Thank you. I just wanted to remind everyone, so this class will next meet for the fourth part on March 23rd. We have a standalone class tomorrow, Thursday, on Jewish Ukraine through the eyes and words of Shalom Aleichem. This class will take place tomorrow at 1 p.m. So we hope to see you there. We also have an additional live class tomorrow evening at 8 p.m., which will be the second class, I believe, in the series, The Invention of the Seven-Day Week, with Dr. Ezra Zuckerman Sivan. As always, you can find out all the information about classes and general offerings, registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes. You can also watch all of the classes live at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again, Rabbi Ziring. I'm looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. And thanks again to everyone who joined us today. We love to see all of you here at Drisha. Have a happy Purim.
Thank you so much. Have a good day. Chag Sameach.